You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to On the Way Home, the podcast where we explore the people and ideas shaping housing, community, and belonging across Canada. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and today I'm joined by Nathi Zamisa, co-executive director of House Canada, a national nonprofit working to create affordable cooperative housing solutions for students and young people. Their work brings together advocacy, development to rethink how student housing can be more equitable, community-driven, and sustainable. Nathi brings a strong background in housing advocacy and community organizing with experience in cooperative housing and student-led initiatives focusing on improving housing access. He is helping to reimagine what student housing can look like beyond traditional residence models and towards community-based, non-market solutions. Let's listen in. Welcome, Nathi, to On the Way Home. We're so excited to have you as a guest.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
We're going to begin with our signature question, which is, what does home mean to you?
Home is the place, capital THE. It's something that's long sought. It's the place where you're kind of building your own community. It's your own family, specifically chosen, and it's the place where you get to rest. I think most importantly, where you're not having to face some of the burdens of the outside world. The place you can go to when you need to, for students, you need to study, you need to cook your meal, you just need to recalibrate for the next day. So home is kind of central in terms of placemaking, but also in terms of kind of fostering your own little sense of belonging within your community. So I'll maybe leave it there because I could probably ramble on for a little while.
Would you share with our listeners about House Canada, for anyone who might not know, and then also tell us a bit about your journey and what led you to, I believe, launch House Canada? What drew you into this world of student community housing? And share. Thank you.
I love to plug House whenever I can. So, House is an acronym for Housing Our University Students Equitably. Really, it started as a small committee of students at York University. It was literally called the Affordable Housing Committee, and we were trying to advocate for more affordable housing on campus. And it was founded back in 2016, well before I was a student. And they'd been negotiating with the university, trying to advocate for more affordable housing for the better part of 2 years, and realized the university's already got some relatively affordable residences, at least compared to the market rents in the area. So why not try to develop their own housing solutions, specifically non-market housing solutions? And that's really kind of what spurred House. We were blessed to be able to meet with the folks from UTIL, the Unité de Travail pour l'Implantation de Logement Étudiant from Quebec. In 2019, they just opened the Woodno Cooperative, and at that time we held a housing symposium as part of the Student Dwell TO project, which is an inter-university project in Toronto. And they really showed us that you can work with students to raise money ethically and socially to build affordable non-market student housing. That's really kind of where I joined House. So I was part of, I used to live in an area that was called the Village at York University. I lived in an 11-bedroom multi-tenant home that was not permitted in accordance with the City of Toronto's bylaws for North York at the time, I should say. And all of my peers around me were dealing with really significant issues. I had a friend of mine who was couch surfing in my one room, I should say, floor surfing for 3 weeks. And eventually we were like, okay, we need to do something to address it. So we organized and we created a little community association. It was called the York Village Housing Association. We were advocating to basically legalize multi-tenant housing because there was no avenues for us to go when there was an issue with our landlord, or they were threatening to displace us, or sometimes a fire marshal would get called and an entire house of anywhere from 6 to 11 people would basically be asked to leave. And so we were like, okay, is there a way to organize around this? And through my work there, I was able to join the Affordable Housing Committee. I was advocating for, let's just say, solutions off campus, and they were advocating for solutions on campus. And together we got a grant from the Community Housing Transformation Center, to whom we are forever thankful. We created the York Nonprofit Housing Society Co-op. So we offered 35% below market housing charges to our members. And that was kind of our pilot for what ended up being House Canada. So it's a long-winded way of kind of how I got involved in House, but ultimately it just came from organizing and working with other students to address our kind of material conditions, and then finding a solution through UTL that we could implement not just at York University, but then bring to campuses across the province of Ontario and now across Canada, where those solutions don't already exist.
And when we look at the student housing landscape in Toronto and Mississauga, what would you say are the biggest challenges students are facing right now?
It's a mix of two things that I think the rest of the rental market is also facing, but it's the question of the availability of student units. This is probably the key piece. So there's some great research that was done by UTL in 2021, backed by research by Desjardins in 2024, and now supported by some of the research that we are doing at the University of Toronto Mississauga campus, University of Toronto St. George campus, York University, OCAD, and now TMU, which pretty much suggests that only 1 in 10 students will actually have access to a residence bed on campus. And so most students are living off campus and they're competing in this private rental market. And the housing that they do have available on campus is relatively expensive. It's being charged at a premium. For example, one single room in a double room, so you're sharing that room, one bed in a double room, I should say. So you're sharing that room with another person, can cost up to $1,700 a month, including a mandatory meal plan. So you have no choice to pay for that meal plan. And so that's kind of one of the real challenges, is that students aren't able to find housing on campus, so they're forced into the private rental market. When you look at the rental markets near post-secondary institutions, and this is no truer than in Toronto, in Mississauga, we see a lot of the similar trends. It's 25% more expensive than rental markets that don't include post-secondary institutions. So when we think about the town and gown relationship between institutions in the cities that they occupy, it's all too real for students. And in those markets, there's a lot of competition. So in Ontario, we have vacancy decontrols. Students are necessarily transitory population. So every time a student moves, so they might be moving from residence off campus, and then moving again because they finally found a place that's a little bit more affordable, landlords increase their rents. And there's actually very much an incentive to have that high student turnover. So students are really stuck, not being able to find housing on campus, and then and being in a really, really competitive market off campus, and they're being subject to quite commonly unfair landlord practices. And many of them, especially folks who are entering the rental market for the first time, those are the folks that are most subject to those issues, I should say. And so it's a kind of a mix of all of those things, but it's really affordability and availability that are the crux. And some students, I should say, if they're looking for where housing is available and where housing is affordable, we're seeing commute times upwards of an hour one way. So they're spending 2 hours of their life, pretty much 3 or 4 days a week, to go do their studies that they're already paying an exorbitant amount of money, and now being subject to a loss of funding through recent changes in OSAP. And it really impacts their mental health. It really impacts their well-being. When we look at some of the statistics on whether students have considered dropping out, it's more than 1 in 10 students across both cities, respectively, or municipalities, I should say, respectively. So students are in this real pickle, and they know they need to be in university. Most jobs in Ontario require a post-secondary degree, so it's not necessarily a choice, but they're being forced to choose between their well-being and getting that degree. So that's kind of the crux of the issue that students are facing right now.
I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I mean, I think our listeners would know this anecdotally, but to actually focus in on this impact, it's very impressionable for me as a mom. I have kids in school as well, and it is, I think about even the options that we've discussed with them of you can stay at home and commute here, or you can go to school and stay on campus. But every scenario is definitely a high cost. And when you think about the impact that could have on us as a nation over time, it definitely is a challenging thought, where we're either, like you said, making decisions, right, about eventually it will be, like you said, kids know they need to go to school now, but what does it mean over the long term if you get priced so far out, or the precarious decisions you're making, like you're saying, of having to pile up. I met a student with his laptop sleeping on the streets of downtown Toronto, and talked to him. He was an international student, and he said, I can't do it all. Like, I'm just, yeah. And that's rough. So if I'm correct, your work is focusing on cooperative and nonprofit housing. Can you jump into how student co-op housing models compare to traditional student residences in Ontario?
Happy to do just that. And just to kind of piggyback on that last sentiment, 1 in 10 students have access to housing on residence, and they're charged a premium. Somewhere around 30% of students are still living with their parents, and that's predominantly domestic students. Some international students have some family members. When we kind of dive deeper into those numbers, a large proportion of those students are still paying rent, though they're living with family. That's worth noting. But we also note that parents are actually bearing the burden of the housing crisis the students are facing. They're contributing significant sums of money, not only to tuition, but to their housing costs. And that includes for students who are, renting privately. Parents are subsidizing the cost of housing, and it's just not a sustainable model, especially right now. If I was to kind of jump back, I guess, to the question, when we look at cooperative, and I'm going to say more broadly non-market housing, but specifically co-op housing, and I'm going to stick to Toronto because this is where we see the most student housing co-ops. Immediately, we see a huge difference in the cost per dwelling unit for an individual renter. So you can look at Campus Cooperative Residence Inc. You can get a single room. They have a wide array of unit mixes, but you can get a single room for roughly $890 a month. And you compare that to roughly the $1,200 that you might be paying in the same area. This is a 10-minute walk from the University of Toronto St. George campus. WYSIC, you have even more affordability options. We're talking about $700, $600 a month if you're looking for that same double room that you're going to be finding on campus for $1,700 a month. And it's, again, a 5 to 10-minute walk from the TMU campus. And more broadly, when we look at, for example, cities like Waterloo with the Waterloo Cooperative Residence Inc., you have a full range, an array of housing charges that students are able to pay. They can get a premium unit and be basically paying whatever market rent is at $1,900 a month. But they also have really affordable units, $600 a month. Again, just across the street from the U Waterloo campus. When we think about student housing, we don't have to think about these really luxury or amenity-rich units that right now are kind of in trend. Like when we look at York University, for example, all of the new student housing units that they're building, they don't really have funding to build it. They've been facing government transfer cuts for the past few decades. And so what they're doing is they're leasing lands to private developers to basically build these units. And those developers are building luxury-rich, amenity-rich, condo-style units because they're really good at attracting students, particularly international students, but they're very poor at retaining them. And so you get this really short-term, really great experience, and then you're kind of forced out into the market again. And it's the same trend that we're seeing, for example, University of Ottawa. They just set up a new 1,200 unit project. And part of the lands that essentially those units are going to be developed on, they actually they terminated a land lease with the Sandy Hill Housing Co-op. So those are longtime co-op members, and this ownership housing. So they're basically tearing down affordable housing. They've had units that have been vacant for months, if not years, and they're going to be building what will very likely be, again, this P3 public-private partnership model. So this P3 model of housing that is not within the income range. It's not what students can afford. And when we look at the numbers, students really can't afford much. UTO's research in 2021 highlighted that students are earning less than $20,000 a year on average, or most students, I should say, are earning less than $20,000 a year on average. Accounting for inflation, that's $25,000 a year. And we're looking at rents that are, in the excess of $19,000 a year that students are paying. That they're in core housing need. Most students are in core housing need, right? They're spending more than 30% of their income. In some cases, 200% of their income on their housing costs. And this is no more true in Toronto. We're seeing the highest rates of core housing need for students. And importantly, we're not seeing that recognition from, for example, Statistics Canada or the CMHC because students are intentionally omitted from our rental market housing survey. So again, I'm just going to come back. Co-op housing really offers a ground up way for students to kind of come together to create a long-term tangible housing solution by, through a legal entity that will allow students in perpetuity to access affordable housing to address what we see as the single largest cost to actually accessing a post-secondary education, the single largest barrier to a post-secondary education for both international and domestic students. And so co-op housing plays a really central role, and we don't see enough of it. That's really the key piece. Less than 0.1% of all the student residences or student housing units that are available are co-op housing units, and yet they're the most affordable. And they're proven. CCRI is the oldest housing co-op in Canada. It's been around since the 30s. WCRI has been around since the 60s. Neil Wyzek since the 70s. They're models that work, and we just don't see the investment, I should say, from all levels of government, and continuing to grow the sector. So I'll kind of wrap it up there, because I could ramble for a while on co-op housing as well.
No, I was going to ask you, where you see housing development programs falling short when it comes to student housing. You touched on a few things there. The data is not captured. You called out a few programs. Is there anything else that you would want to highlight there? What would you want to see happen to turn this around when we're, considering how we need to move the needle in housing across Canada?
There's a big push right now, with Build Canada Homes, to create a bunch of new units of housing, and a large amount of that is supposedly going to be affordable housing. At least that's what Build Canada Homes is there for, specifically for those nonprofit and affordable housing projects. One of the key gaps that we see, and recently CMHC on December 19th, they terminated their capital repairs and renewals funding program. One of the big gaps is that there isn't the funding for those capital repairs and renewals. The student housing co-ops are, again, hundreds of years old, in some cases decades of years old. They need access to that funding for the deferred maintenance costs associated with those buildings, those aging buildings. So at a federal level, we need programs that really kind of consider not just the construction of net new units, but maintaining the existing units or the existing affordable housing stock that does exist, especially for students. And we do want to see that Canada Rental Protection Fund come out and launch, because these co-ops are well positioned to kind of leverage and borrow against their properties to potentially acquire other properties. And that's the real piece, is that these co-ops are not growing. WCRI is the exception. They've been growing. They're the largest student housing co-op in North America. They've been doing a great job. Shouts out to Lana Wong, the executive director there, that's doing amazing work. But we really do need more programs like that. And we don't see a lot of investment from, I should say, the province, especially in Ontario. What we do see is investment, again, in new units, like the project that is going up at TMU, multi-million dollars in investments. And TMU is amongst the most unaffordable, I should say, the most expensive housing option. Their units are amongst the most expensive housing option in the city of Toronto. And they're going to continue to build those again, amenity-rich, luxury-style units. But where we've seen the most success, and I'm looking to Quebec and at UTL, is when you see all levels of government really supporting student housing. Student housing is, a kind of wicked challenge. If you're able to build units, dedicated, purpose-built student housing units, you're preventing students from actually displacing. And there's this term called studentification, where students in those areas, they actually displace low and medium income households because they're willing to pay more, not for the entire household, but on a per unit basis, so pay per room. So single family home stock is effectively being eroded. So when you're able to build those purpose-built units, you prevent the displacement of low and medium income households. And at the same time, when we look at the municipalities and the work that's happening in Montreal and in Quebec, cities are working with developers like UTL to, for example, upzone properties that they own. And it's very, very simple fixes, very, very simple changes that turn a $2 or $3 million property into a potentially $10 or $20 million property, which really impacts the financing terms. And then you get, again, supports from the province of Quebec, access to programs from the federal government for the actual construction and development of net new units. And you have a recipe for success. And in UTL in Quebec, they have over 2,000 units either built or scheduled to be built. That's affordable nonprofit student housing, and they've done it across multiple different cities. And they're now able to develop using really innovative methods, modular, prefabricated. The project at Rimouski was entirely kind of prefab modular homes for students, and it was built in a record amount of time. And so we really need support from all levels of government. I think it starts at the municipality and basically taking this land and making sure that it can reach its highest and best use. Support from the province to help with those operating costs, and supports from the federal government to help with construction. And so we want to see those programs revived wherever possible.
From a financial and development perspective, what would you say are the biggest barriers right now to scaling non-market student housing?
In Ontario, it's absolutely, I should say, maybe in the GTA, it's land. So we made our first acquisition. It's a single family home. It was a strategic acquisition. It's along a major street, so just along Keele. And that land cost $1 million. And there's a group called Student Housing Nova Scotia in Nova Scotia. They were able to acquire a low-rise residential building for just under $1 million, right? So it's, we're comparing apples and oranges, but land is a really, really big challenge in Toronto. And all of the risk is really kind of on students and on developers. And at the same time, when we look at opportunities to access low-cost land, we can look at universities, the very institutions that are providing 99-year land leases to private developers to build housing that students really, really want, but not necessarily that they need. And there isn't a willingness, at least, to be developing on those lands, developing affordable non-market student housing. So land is a really, really key piece. And we're seeing some progress in Toronto with the new academic housing strategy, that there's interest in bringing together a nonprofit developer, a post-secondary institution, and municipal funding to actually realize that. But progress is quite slow. So land is a really big barrier. Not being able to access the land leases that make development affordable is a really big barrier. And having lenders that are willing to be flexible. When we speak to folks, I'll just say more broadly, the co-op housing operators, they're not able to borrow so that they can facilitate their capital repairs, because lenders don't view them necessarily as the most reliable entities and operating entities. So it's kind of a real challenge for them in that space. But I would say overall land and the capacity within the sector is the other piece. There are not a lot of folks operating in the non-market student housing space specifically. Some folks are doing non-market housing, and then students happen to be living in those units. Even when we go to the Cooperative Housing Federation, the National General Meeting, there isn't a whole wealth of young people that are there, because it's mostly home ownership opportunities and not necessarily those non-share equity co-ops. And so looking at where we can get more support in terms of building capacity, building the knowledge, the skills to actually be able to develop, so that we can tap into those sources of financing, I think is going to be one of the challenges that we're hoping to solve. And as we build out different chapters across different campuses, probably across Canada, really.
Really incredible and thought-provoking. When you look ahead, what gives you hope when it comes to building more affordable, community-focused student housing? What needs to happen next to make it a reality? And before we get into that too, when you were talking about like universities have the land, and in many cases it's being given to the private sector to develop, and so that's resulting in the luxury units that students can't sustainably afford. If you could, make a call on what needs to happen there, how would you want to see that? How would you structure that out?
The Toronto Community Benefits Network has done really great work negotiating meaningful community benefits agreements when there are developments within certain communities. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from there. The key one being, if there's a developer that's going to be, building in let's just say any neighborhood in Toronto, the benefits network will push to make sure that a certain number of those units, generally around 20% of those units, are affordable. So if there is going to be, a new development on university lands, to their credit, I will say private developers, they are providing some degree of affordability, somewhere around like 10% of the units need to be affordable, but increasing that threshold is key. Making sure that it's, at least 1/5 of the units, if not more, is key. And where those developers might not want to do that because, it affects their bottom line, they know they only have 99 years to get a return on their investment. That's where actors like House come in, right? We say we will build and we will operate those units affordably in perpetuity. And they will not erode. The percentage of those units will not erode. That actually builds our coffers to be able to build more and more affordable housing units. So I think that's the key piece, and making sure that post-secondary institutions are negotiating and fighting for more affordability options for students, because we don't necessarily see that. Right now, we're actually seeing, at the St. George campus for University of Toronto, there's a new residence that was built with Daniels at the Quad at York University. For the first time, we're actually seeing them deal with occupancy issues, right? There are not enough students that are going to fill those units. And yet just adjacent to York University, the village at York University, there's basically an overflow of demand for those very rooms that I was living in when I was an undergraduate student. We know that there is a demand for housing, despite changes to the international study permit caps, despite changes to OSAP, there is a demand for housing, but it needs to be affordable. So universities need to push, I should say students' unions also need to work with their administrations to push for more affordability options, and labor unions too. It's really kind of part of a solidarity movement, because those students will end up being the staff and or the professors or faculty at that campus long term. So creating those opportunities in the market, working with nonprofit partners, for example, like House, to tap into programs that otherwise might not be available to private developers, really, really key. And I think the thing that gives me hope to see that may be possible, and I'll provide an anecdote. The work that we do really engages students. We do design consultations, we do research on the ground, so we create paid work integrated learning opportunities for students to do research, to collect data. And at TMU, as a part of our research, we had a cohort of planning students that were so interested in our model, they effectively just created their own House chapter. And we just had our first AGM this year. We went from a board of basically 3 or 4 members to 6 members in a span of pretty much 3 months. And ultimately, we're primed to be running a campaign there that can help generate roughly $2 million annually of investments, student dollars, to create, acquire, and operate affordable non-market housing within 30 minutes from the campus. And it's students that want to do it. It's students that are paying for the housing that will eventually save them. The way that we say is you can spend $30 a year to save up to $200 a month on your rent. And students see the value proposition, and they're the ones that are organizing around it. The young people, they're the ones that are part of those community benefits committees, negotiating those community benefits agreements with private developers. And we just want to continue to build that capacity and build that momentum, because we're in a pickle. And we know that we can't really wait for the government, we can't wait for our administrations, and we can't wait for private developers to provide us with solutions. We're doing it ourselves, and I think we're doing a pretty good job at it. So that's really what gives me hope.
Well, I'm so impressed with you, Nathi, and your passion and your leadership definitely shines through on this topic. So appreciative of all you're doing and the way you're mobilizing that traction for the student community. Before we go, is there anything else you want to add that you believe would truly move the needle on affordable student housing in Canada? Or any other last thoughts you want to give us?
I would say, if there's any students that are listening to the podcast, if you see us doing research, please help us by spending 5-10 minutes filling out our surveys. Come to our meetings, learn about how we work and how we operate, because we will figure out ways to create jobs for you to support our campaigns and to mobilize locally. Get involved in student governments and in student politics and in student organizing. Today there's a rally at Queen's Park, pretty much protesting the changes to the OSAP funding structure. OSAP is a huge, and tuition is a huge component of the overall cost that you have as a student. Housing is generally, if you're a domestic student, 2.5 times that cost, right? So we can organize materially at your campus, and it doesn't take much. You know, in 2 years, we can acquire and operate a single family home, and we can buy a single family home every single year. We can hold that money over 2 or 3 years and acquire and potentially develop land. And the funding is available. The moment is really now. There's Build Canada homes that will fill in the gap. There's CMHC funding that'll, you know, through the apartment construction loan program that allow us to develop. And I really believe in students, and there's a lot of pressures that they're facing, but this is one real avenue that they can take. Specifically, organizing around housing is an avenue that they can take to improve their everyday lives, and to improve the lives of everybody that's going to follow in their footsteps and go to post-secondary or get a post-secondary education. So it starts with y'all, and we're here. House is here to help kind of build that capacity, and make sure that, you know, y'all can skip through all of the nonsense that comes with figuring out the administration, the legal, the financing. That's what our staff is for, and we want you to be a part of that staff. So that's really kind of my message.
So for any listeners who might not be students but want to support this cause, want to take action, what can they do? What's a practical step they can take?
Reach out. You know, when we see things like an academic housing strategy from the city of Toronto, really push for nonprofits to be involved within the funding and development process. We don't see a lot of funding from the city of Toronto that works for students. The multi-unit residential acquisition program, for example, that's now being modeled in the city of Hamilton. It's being espoused similarly in cities like Mississauga. There are certain conditions that just won't work for students. They prioritize folks on the city of Toronto housing waitlist. Think about the people who are going to be part of that economy, that are going to be paying for, you know, those pension contributions, that are going to be supporting y'all as we age and as we retire, and find ways to join them when they're doing deputations. For example, when we're talking about the multi-tenant housing, the citywide framework on multi-tenant housing in the city of Toronto, you know, students showed up because students are living in rooming houses, students are living in multi-tenant houses, and they're pushing back against people who don't want to, you know, deal with tall grass in their front yard. Meanwhile, students are going homeless, right? If students are able to save money, they're also able to save time, and they're able to, you know, do things like lawn care and lawn maintenance, right? So stand in solidarity with young people, stand in solidarity with mature students, especially students with families, at every single one of those opportunities where there are public consultations, and reach out to us as well. We're happy to share some of our research, where we can go, MPs and MPPs that, you know, need to hear about how it's going to be, student housing is impacting their communities, especially when there's a post-secondary institution involved. And really, I'm just saying, challenge NIMBYism wherever possible, especially when it comes to student housing. Because really, if you're able to push for more student housing, you're preserving the housing stock that you may have been fortunate enough to access, or that you might be facing challenges in accessing at the moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nathi, for joining us on the show today. Appreciate all that you've shared and how you're continuing to lead this work.
I appreciate being here. Thank you so much, Emmy. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.
Today's episode featured Nathi Zamisa, co-executive director of House Canada, whose work is helping to reshape the conversation around student housing in Canada. His leadership highlights the importance of cooperative models and community-driven solutions in addressing the growing challenges students face in accessing safe and affordable housing. Through advocacy, development, and collaboration, he's advancing new approaches that prioritize equity, belonging, and long-term affordability. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by Blue Door. Stay tuned for more conversations exploring innovative solutions to housing challenges across the country.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.